Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining. We're going to start this Foundry Trends webinar. I think this is the fourth webinar that we've done. I'm looking third, actually. I'm incorrect. It's the third one. It's part of our new Trends series. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, we're going to talk about hyperreality, what it is, how it's going to affect the lives of consumers and artists, why artists should get involved. And we're going to talk a bit about the research and tools that are needed to create hyper-realistic content. But before we jump into that, I just want to say a few words about Foundry Trends. This is the first webinar actually where we've launched Foundry Trends. It was only launched yesterday. You can see the URL there. And this is a new place on the Foundry website where we can keep all the kind of up-and-coming trend content online, including these webinars, but also articles and other pieces of content from our research team as well. It's a really great page. I recommend that you go there as soon as you can and sign up to the newsletter, and you'll get lots of new information coming into your inbox as soon as there's some new information available. And go there now as well if you like, because there's lots of articles already there about many different topics: AR, VR, cloud, real-time technology, all the kinds of things that are kind of trending in our industry at the moment. Okay, so that's Foundry Trends. I'm going to jump right into the content now of this webinar, which is hyperreality. So first of all, I just want to talk a little bit about Foundry and about our mission, which has always been to create things or make the tools to make things look as realistic as possible. But it's not just been about realistic images, it's also been about the workflow, the pipeline, making things efficient, making things reusable, making it so it's not just a one-off, it's something that you can repeat. Yeah, we work on problems like how thousands of artists can work together on 2,000 visual effect shots like Star Wars, and sometimes a shot taking over 100 people and thousands of hours, and still you see image on the screen where things look realistic. We also work on projects like how shoe designers can shave months off the time it takes to get their latest shoe ideas into the hands of us by designing immediately on 3D instead of pen and paper. So what we do is solve the problems at the intersection of art and technology. So that's kind of where we're coming from. But today we're going to talk about hyperreality and what that trend is, and kind of how it might affect you and how it's also affecting us at Foundry. And hyperreality is actually a term that's been around for quite a long time. It's not a new term. It was invented in 1981 by a French philosopher and socialist called Jon Wadelton. I think I got that right. That was my hardest part of the entire presentation, is pronouncing the French. Yeah, he invented this term, and hyperreality's kind of been bandied around a few different places what that term means. But I'm going to take the one off Wikipedia, which says that hyperreality is an inability of consciousness to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality. So immediately what jumps into your mind is like, oh, this is AR or VR or something like that. But actually it's more than that. It's something that's been around for quite a while, like I said before, and it comes up in lots of different sort of contexts. And that was one of the reasons I chose this image here to start us off, which is a slogan from Coca-Cola back in the 90s. If anyone's kind of my age, they might remember this slogan, "Can't beat the real thing." And I couldn't actually post my favorite image of this, which is like a Coca-Cola can sitting in a forest next to cheese and grapes and things like that. But I chose this one where it's against wood paneling. It's kind of similar. But what it's sort of implying there is can't beat the real thing, is that Coke is so real that it's actually more realistic than nature. Coke is sitting there next to the forest, next to the cheese. It's a man-made thing that it kind of equals the real thing, which is nature. And this is kind of what I mean by like hyperreality has been around for a while, in that it's the fabric of pretend reality being more real than real reality. So I'll give you some more examples that are a bit more kind of recent, which is stuff like reality TV. So you watch, in the UK you might watch a program like Made in Chelsea, or I guess in the US it would be Made I don't know, the Kardashians show, and on that show they're real people on TV, but yet are they doing a scripted thing, or are they not doing a scripted thing? We're watching their lives. It's like a documentary about their lives, but it's not really a documentary about their lives. It's a kind of posed version of that life, even though they are real people. It's another example of hyperreality. It's more real than real. It's like an extension. And just to close off this kind of history of it, everybody probably on the webinar at the moment uses Facebook, I imagine. It's just another way that actually Facebook is another version of hyperreality. Like when you go and post your pictures up online, are you kind of posting your real reality, or is this what you want to see the world to see as the reality of your life? That's another kind of way of describing hyperreality. But I'm going to talk about more definite visceral hyperreality, something that the new kind of trend where this term is getting attached, which is more about VR and AR and making things look hyperreal, making them look part of your environment, where actually when you're inside one of these experiences, you can't tell the difference between the real and the unreal. And so that's what we're going to focus on today, that VR and AR and mixed reality. And just to kind of kick it off, I want to quote a number from a recent consumer VR research poll that we actually backed, that said that nearly a third of people believe that real-world experiences will eventually be replaced by virtual reality. So that's a very big number. So that's clearly pointing to the future is going to be some sort of hyper-reality. So just before we move on to the AR and VR stuff, I just want to think about the history of this as well, that, you know, like simulating reality has been around for quite a long time. You know, we started out with people doing paintings, and then we eventually, you know, invented the camera, and we took photographs, and then we invented moving images, and we added cinema, and we added sound, we added 3D, as in 3D glasses, and all these things added layers of immersion, making a closer and closer kind of simulation of reality, and maybe even making it better than it was. And these days with visual effects, and this is why I showed this this image, you've got to a point where actually the simulation, or the thing that you watch on the screen, is better or different or more interesting than the real thing. And I think this is a really interesting one to watch back when you watch this compositing shot. This was done in Nuke. That it starts out with a kind of regular road in the middle of spring, and then it ends up with a snow-covered scene in winter, completely different. And you see these sort of invisible visual effects a lot when you watch the cinema, and it just shows that actually what you see these days on the screen is not real, and very subtly things have changed a lot, so that knowing what's real and what isn't is really getting mixed up, which is kind of that definition of hyperreality. So taking it on to actual VR. So VR, I'm sure everybody knows what VR is. You put on their glasses and then you step into a virtual world. It's kind of taking that history of kind of levels of immersion that I talked about earlier and going that extra mile. Instead of sitting in front of a screen, you're now walking into the screen and stepping inside this virtual world that's been created. But there's kind of a step further than that, which there's another way that this term hyperreality is being used, which is when you step into a VR world that actually has physical representation that maybe matches the VR world. So this is a bit of advertising from The Void, which is a location-based VR outfit who've got, I think they've got one in US and New York, sorry, US is in California, and a few other places. I might be wrong with that, the exact locations, but it's in a few different locations around the world. And their thing is to have VR, but not just VR where you sit there by yourself. You go in there with your friends. They have backpacks on so that you're untethered, so you can walk around a kind of space without having to have this big wire coming out of your back. And they have things like physical props so that the virtual world starts to match the physical world as well, so that you're not just having that VR experience, that virtual reality experience. It's somewhat more of a hyper reality experience where you're getting the sense of touch and extra kind of interactions like that. And this can even go as far as being a bit more like a theme park, where actors can interact with you as well and touch you and do things like that within the space. And we're seeing that in a few different places as well, not just theme parks like this, but roller coasters. There's something like 20 different roller coasters that are getting VR kit installed. And again, it's a more real than real situation where you're on a roller coaster, and instead of having a VR experience where you look like you're on a roller coaster, you actually are on a roller coaster, but then they can change it without rebuilding the roller coaster. So you can imagine you go on the roller coaster, instead of it going through the hills or whatever, you're now skiing somewhere, or you're surfing, or some other reuse of that reality. So it's extending it out just from the sight to now motion. And I think this idea of location-based VR is very much something that is a trend that a lot of people are jumping on. In China, for instance, they have hundreds of VR parks, they call them now, which are this kind of location-based VR, as I described it, where it's a theme park where you can go and experience VR rather than having it home. IMAX opened a VR in New York as well, so they're having a kind of VR location-based too. So it's a good way to experience VR because you get to go to the location, you get to have the top-of-the-line equipment, and you also get to get that extra level of physical contact as well as the visual and the audio. So that's kind of happening now. That's another version of hyperreality. And I'm going to show you a video next of kind of a vision of maybe what hyperreality would be if we didn't just have VR where we're walking into the 3D world. What about if we had AR, or mixed reality, where the 3D world or 3D content is coming into our world? So we're going kind of the reverse. And I've got this great video here, actually titled Hyperreality as well, another version. And I'll pronounce Mr. Matsuda is the name of the person that did it, Kaiichi Matsuda. And if I got that wrong, I apologize. And he's done this great video of hyperreality that actually went viral across the internet. So you might have seen it before, but I'm just going to replay it for you. I'll probably give you about a minute of this to give you the general idea, and then we'll move on. Oh, and I forgot to adjust the microphone.
Fantastic. Great. Nice. Great.
Bastante. Apúrate si quieres una buena calificación.
Voy lo más rápido que puedo.
¿Has pensado en correr? Es saludable y eficiente.
Seguro que no hay más trabajos disponibles. Yo estudié para ser profesora y estoy haciendo mercados.
Y además puedes quedarte con los puntos de fidelización. Eres una amante afortunada. Tienes que confiar en la aplicación. ¿Te sientes inspirada? Gracias. Chao.
¿Quién soy yo? No, eso no es lo que quiero decir. ¿Para dónde voy? No. Voy a volver a empezar. Olvídalo.
Estoy presente ahora. Me amo. Estoy libre de mi ira. Estoy libre de mi tristeza. Y el amor es mi experiencia.
Ayer.
Olá, me llamo María.
Okay, so I'll stop it there. So So as you can see in that video, hopefully you could see that's really kind of taking it to an extreme where the real world and the computer-generated world have kind of merged into one. And it looks like in that video that really life has become a gamification of all of life has become gamified, and by the you rate your bus driver as soon as you get off. You interact with many different elements all the time. So whether life is going to be like that or not, I'm not sure. Let's maybe hope not, or maybe some people hope it is. But that's the kind of vision or the kind of technology that is coming on stream now. Sort of things that Magic Leap are showing in their kind of in some of their kind of videos, and sorts of things you see with HoloLens, in that you can go into your living room and see 2D screens everywhere. But I recommend that you go and see the rest of that video online, and the URLs are back there. It's hyperreality.co, just to watch the full experience, because it's really interesting. All right, so moving on. So we're kind of talked about the history of hyperreality and a little bit about the terminology, and I was going to go on to a bit of the use cases and hopefully show you some good use cases that really show that this can be a great technology that's going to help people or help the way that you do your work. First thing I want to go into is talk about shoe design and talk about industrial kind of visualization. And the reason I'm talking about this in this slide is because of some numbers that I got actually from a report that I pulled from Greenlight Industries. And what it was saying is that the industrial use cases of VR and AR content creation or content market will be 26.7 billion by 2021. So it's quite a big market for content. But what they claim is that enterprise content, and when I say enterprise, that means things like training or retail or product development, they claim that enterprise content will be 18.2 billion, which is about 68%. And just to put it into context, they think that gaming will be 4.7 billion or 18%. So 68 to 18%, and cinematic VR and other things are in the mix there as well. So it just really shows, and I've seen this in more than one report, that enterprise content is really going to be explosive. And I think when I explain some of these things, it might be obvious as to why. So I'll give you an example of this shoe design and what the kind of iterations are for that. So we work with on a tool that allows you to designing 3D shoes, and the typical workflow for designing shoes is actually kind of pen and paper, and then going out to CAD design. But then at some point you need to see what the samples are going to look like, see what the design is going to look like in the real world. So the typical workflow for that is, okay, well, you need to make a CAD design of the shoe, then you need to send it off to someone to manufacture, maybe it's off to China, or make the shoe, send back the samples, in a bag, and then you have a physical briefcase. We can take those samples and maybe show them in a showroom or your concept store or somewhere like that to see what they look like in context against the rest of the catalog and what they look like in real life. So that's as you can imagine, quite a long journey. It's quite a lot of steps, a lot of physical things need to be made, not easy to change your mind quickly. Maybe that's a 6 to 18-week cycle to do a review of a shoe from the samples. But what we see with virtual reality or mixed reality is potentially this cycle could be reduced to almost zero, whereby you could, say, walk into a virtual version of the concept store and see the shoes virtually against a photoreal version of that concept store. Or when we think about mixed reality or AR, you could go to the concept store physically, but then still see a photoreal version of the shoe in context virtually in that store. And that's potentially saving a lot of money, a lot of time, and maybe making you be able to be more creative because you can do more iterations. But one thing I would say about that is that idea of mixed reality is that compared to that video that we saw before where everything looked like a computer-generated overlay on the world, mixed reality is aiming to try and make that item, that CG item, look like it blends seamlessly with the real world, not looking like a piece of CG. And that's what we're really interested here at Foundry as well, because that's what we've done for years in cinema. You know, mixing CG and live action is something that we're all about when it comes to compositing. It's making that thing look believable. And I think that's what mixed reality needs to get to. Some other examples as well, like, you know, I'm sure that you can probably think of them yourself, but just let you know, some of them is thinking about, say, shopping online as well, like Amazon. You know, in the future when you've got these sort of AR, augmented reality glasses, or however we do it in the technology, will you really be shopping online on a flat web page for items? So you want to buy something that goes into your kitchen, or a kettle, or something like that, and you want to see what it looks like. You're going to be doing that in augmented reality. You're going to see a version of that product in front of your kitchen, see what it looks like, realistically placed there. You're not going to do it, I think, on a web page. And you could probably take this to the real extreme. Going back to the video that we saw earlier, where the whole world is like augmented. Maybe you wouldn't even have to buy the items that you physically, perhaps. Maybe you just buy them virtually, because if everybody's got the AR glasses, then you just can look at the virtual version. And this is the sort of thing like, if anyone remembers Second Life, I think it's still around, that idea of the virtual world. You go in there, people pay real money for the virtual clothes inside Second Life. So you can imagine a world where we've all got AR glasses and you pay perhaps for virtual clothing, because everybody's got the glasses, they can see what it looks like on you. Maybe you don't need the physical version of the clothing. Well, hopefully you need at least one layer, but you could layer on top perhaps. Another use case which I think is really interesting is like, you know, this idea of training and so on that we talked about before. That was one of the big kind of verticals that this report talked about. So, you know, what can VR do for medical training, for instance, is when, you know, in the past you might have had to have performed or practice on a real patient, or something that doesn't respond the same way as a real patient. Whereas with VR or AR, if we can make it hyper realistic, then actually you can interact and do training that looks more real than it would be if you did it in surgery. Another really interesting use case that I heard was about how, you know, VR could help with therapy or medical therapy and pain. There's a really interesting study about how VR has been used to help amputees, for instance, because if you have a limb amputated, there's a thing called phantom limb pain that occurs, and this is because it's not a pain that you can actually fix with any sort of painkillers. It's a pain where your brain is disconnected from the fact that you don't have a limb. It can't compute that the limb is gone, so this causes pain. And what they've found is that one way to alleviate this pain in the physical world is to do some trick like putting a mirror in the middle of your body, say, that reflects one side of your body with the other. So say you've lost your left arm, put a mirror that makes your right arm look like your left arm and kind of mirrors your body, and then alleviates the pain because your brain sees this limb and can accept, well, gets tricked into thinking it's still there, and that alleviates the pain. And there was a study by Aalborg University that said that VR technology can do the same thing and potentially do it even better. So trick the amputee's brain into thinking that it's still in control of the missing limb, not just a mirror image of it. And again, though, these things need to look realistic. If you can, you know, if you can make them look realistic, that's the way you should go. Instead of having you don't want to really have that amputee with a Terminator arm or some sort of CG-looking arm. That would be maybe more frightening than the therapy would fix. So I've gone on a bit about the use cases and kind of the definitions of hyperreality, and I want to talk a bit about where we are really now with AR and VR, and where the technology is and what the challenges are, and what we think the tools need to be in the future, and kind of some of the research that is going on. And I chose this picture here to kind of kick off this section because I feel like really with AR and VR and mixed reality, we're really right at the beginning. And this is a picture of Louis Daguerre, and it's a daguerreotype of Louis Daguerre. Daguerreotype is a type of photo invented before there was print photography, and one of the first tools that could capture reality in a hyperreal or a real way. Before this, they had painting, but it wasn't easy. People thought this was magic, by the way, instilling your soul into the picture, and probably the same way that some people, when they go into VR now, think that it's going to cause chaos, but it probably won't. But yeah, why I picked this picture is because it wasn't easy to create one of these. To make the image, the daguerreotypist would polish a sheet of silver-plated copper to a mirror finish, treat it with fumes so that its surface was light sensitive, expose it to a camera for seconds to a few minutes, make the resulting latent image visible by fuming it with mercury, so you have to be careful you didn't kill yourself, remove its sensitivity to light by treating it with chemicals, rinse it, dry it, then seal it behind glass in a protective enclosure. And it was a one-off. You couldn't make any more of these. There was no printing or anything like this. It was a one-off, very easy to disturb and destroy. And I feel like, roundabout way, that AR and VR are kind of in that same place right now. I feel like we're doing a lot of one-offs. There's a lot of one-off challenges, and that many times you don't get to repeat what you did before moving forward. I think this goes back to what I was saying earlier about we need to get to a place where AR and VR are becoming as pipelined or as tool-heavy or as repeatable as visual effects and cinema are getting, that we can make this thing scalable. And at the moment, it's a bit more of a one-off, not just creatively, but not just technically, but also creatively. And just to think about how much more content there needs to be, I'm just going to pull another report that said, I mean, maybe these aren't true, but if they are true, we've got to do a lot of work. This report, IDC report, claimed that AR and VR markets will hit 162 billion by 2020. 2020 is not very far put away. And to put that into perspective, the current revenue for markets in 2016 was 5.2 billion. So a massive amount more VR and AR revenue, which then means content. And who's going to make all this stuff? So I'm going to talk a bit about the challenges now. The challenges kind of we know now, and a little bit about the research that's coming in the future to help solve these things. First of all, there's the challenge of VR, as in captured VR, something that you capture with a camera, and then you go into the VR space to see something that's essentially pre-recorded. And I'm sure you know all of this, but there's a lot of challenges there. Multiple cameras, or potentially with different settings, challenges to stitch them all together, issues with parallax, issues with stereo, issues with compositing into that space. And this is something that is now getting easier. 3 or 4 years ago, you had to build your own camera to do this sort of stuff. These days, you can buy off-the-shelf cameras. There's great software around for stitching, like AutoPano. There's Kara for Nuke for doing compositing in that space. There's tools from After Effects. There's cameras now that come with their own included stitching, like the Google solution, which does a great job of stitching in the cloud. So we're getting there with the camera capture eventually. But there's still issues with VR capture, which I'll talk about in a minute, in that VR capture in this way with cameras doesn't lend itself to a great sense of immersion, and therefore maybe doesn't give it that hyperreal kind of feeling that we want. Next challenge is the challenge of real-time, or the challenges of game engines. So before I showed you what it means to capture something, and that's got some limitations because it's only captured from one location, which means you can't walk behind things, you can't get a free roam inside an environment, and you can't interact with things. To do that, you need to run it in a game engine, and that's got a lot of its own challenges, like 90 frames per second rendering per eye, mobile devices are not kind of powerful enough to render this stuff in real time. For mixed reality, you need to do lighting capture. Getting game assets into the engines quite hard because you've got to reduce the complexity of them so they can run in real time. Digital humans, I just did this because I need to put digital humans in this talk. Digital humans are very hard as well. Capturing human expressions to lay on top of the digital humans is not easy. Lots of cameras involved. So lots of difficulties in doing stuff in game engines. And I think I need to shout out that one of the most difficult things still is creating the actual 3D content stuff itself, not let alone putting it into the game engine. Just creating 3D assets is hard, and you're going to need a lot of them if we believe that this market is going to be as big as they say. I mentioned before that the capture from one point of view and stitched together has got its limitations in that you can't look behind things and so on. Well, there is a way around this, and this is capturing with multiple cameras, either as a light field or a multi-capture array, or outside-in capture, where you have kind of a ring of cameras pointing inwards, capturing a volumetric capture. And this will get us somewhere where we can capture more than just from one point of view, which will allow you to have more realism and make it more hyperreal than you currently can in VR. And this is technology that's kind of coming on stream now, but it's not quite ready for the mainstream. There's a lot of challenges like data size, what to do in post, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a few companies working out there on this. We're working on it ourselves, and this is a video from one of the research projects we're doing for light fields in Nuke. There's 8i doing volumetric capture for characters for AR and mixed reality. There's Lytro, of course, making their cinema camera and also their Emerge and other cameras for VR. So there are players in the market for this. But as I said before, still many challenges in terms of data and post-production that we need to overcome. Another challenge is, and again, more of a research thing, is what to do in AR in terms of the physical world. How do we match the physical world to the CG world? So if we think back to the video that I showed you earlier with all of these overlays on the real world, that hyperreality, they all would completely sync to the real world as you moved around. But that's actually not an easy thing to do. You need to detect where everything is in the physical world. And here we've got an example of one of our staff doing it on a project that we're doing, where he's scanning the world with a Tango device, which is Google's AR kind of kit. And that allows us to map out where all the geometry is in the room and start to create a virtual version of the space that we're in. But it's still a slow process, and there's still a lot of challenges there, like how do you capture the lighting so everything looks more realistic? How do you detect where all the objects are in the scene and then do things appropriate? And there's tools out there to help with this as well. So like I mentioned before, the Tango from Google is basically got a depth sensor on the front to allow us to start building out these point clouds and representations of the geometry. You probably saw a few weeks ago that Apple announced what they call AR Kit, which is similar to the kind of Tango, different approach, but that's doing a similar thing as in building up a geometry representation of the world, which then you can insert CG content over the top of. And there's also tools like Vuforia, that's kind of the standard for AR. That's an SDK that you can get for Android and iPhone, allowing you to do AR. So all those things kind of help, but most of probably the AR things you've seen, you'll notice that the AR content or the CG content doesn't really interact with the environment. So it'll be something like your Pokemon Go, where the CG object just happens to appear in front of you, but it doesn't get occluded by any objects that come in front of it. It doesn't cast any shadows. It doesn't have realistic lighting. And that's not where we want to go in the future. If we want to make it hyper-real, it's got to have all those things. It's got to be occluded. It's got to be able to detect walls. And I think another challenge to all of this is, like, how do you author for this content? Like, in a world where you're trying to make an entertainment piece of a character that's maybe walking around a house. How do you author for that? Like, you don't know where the door is going to be. You don't know what it should do when it hits a chair. This is all kind of game logic and AI that we're going to need for this mixed reality or AR world. And my last point on AR and detecting the world, like I've showed in this video, is I believe that this sort of technology, when we're doing scanning, is probably only going to be needed for unknown spaces like this when inside a house. I get a feeling, especially with Google and its self-driving cars, with essentially LiDAR scanning everything in the world, that data, that 3D data, is going to be in a database somewhere of the streets, of the the sort of static objects that won't move, and you'll just be able to buy that static data and get access to it. And I don't know who will sell it to us. Maybe it'll be Google, maybe it'll be somebody else, but that's what I imagine there will be, a database, 3D database of the world somewhere. But they can't get inside your house like this, unless maybe the Tango just starts, yeah, everybody's mobile phone just uploads to Google. I don't know. Another thing that's a big challenge is for game engines and AR or VR in general is reusing assets. That's a hard thing. You know, we want to live in a world where you do a feature film or you do a commercial and you make a really high-res version of the assets, and you want to be able to publish them out to a game engine or publish them out to your 3D render or publish them out to some unknown format in the future that's at a different resolution. So that's a big challenge right now, and there's been quite a few research projects on it in the past. And we're also doing one as well called Project Bunsen, which is kind of not for the entertainment industry, but more for AC, but it's got that idea of trying to reuse assets by applying different rules so that when you bring in an asset from CAD, you can apply the same type of shader for the metal surface, say, as it would need in PRMan compared to RenderMan, and get the same result instead of basically having to do all the work manually, which is what you would have had to, what you really have to do now. And I think this will extend to entertainment as well, because we don't want to be continually remaking assets. And one of the bigger challenges with that is not just remapping materials and shaders and reducing the complexity of the geometry. That's quite hard, but I think we can get a handle of that. The even bigger challenge is reusing rigs and animated characters, because a rig on a feature film is very, very complicated. It doesn't run in real time, has a lot of nuance to it, whereas running 90 frames per second in a game engine, that rig needs to be very simple. And the current process is, of course, not automatic. You have to do everything twice. And I have seen some companies trying to get around this problem, and I think that's going to be another challenge in the future that we're all going to have to address. So I'm getting near the end now. Got a few more research slides that we've been playing around with too, which is again about the game engines and making it easy to play with the game engines, because when it comes to mixed reality and AR content and VR content, a lot of it is going to be game engine driven, but I don't believe that the game engines are going to have all the tools in them. They're going to be an engine rather than the thing where you create the content. And what we've done here in this research project, you can see that we've got a model here of like a cliff, an environment that we've created in Modo, our modeling tool, and we can click a button and actually send that over to a running game engine with the assets inside it. So really closing that circle between, creating the assets and then seeing what they look like inside a running game engine. So we're actually doing this over the network. So we go over to the other laptop over here. We can see that in there we now have the asset updating, and now you can see a new version of the asset coming in. That's actually something that is coming to a Modo release soon from kind of a research department. And it's a two-way thing too. You can actually modify the assets inside game engine and go back out. And I really believe that this or some variation of this is how the workflows are going to be in the future. It's just an easy backwards and forwards, make it that kind of iteration loop, nice and short. I keep going on about how much 3D content there's going to need to be, but I think that one of the things that will make it easier is being able to actually use VR or AR to start creating that 3D content itself, because you're really using the 2D screen when you're creating 3D content, using the 2D screen as an abstraction onto the 3D world, and it's not a natural way of working. I think for, natural as in you couldn't just sit a kid in front of a computer and say create a 3D object. They would have to really think about it quite a lot. Whereas going into a 3D space like VR, they can immediately understand the 3D space because they're used to walking around in it. So, the likes of Tilt Brush or Quill from Oculus kind of vouch for that going inside that 3D world and creating lines by just drawing in the air is a real powerful feature. Here what I'm showing you on this video is just another research project we've got, which is connecting our content creation tool, Modo, directly to a VR headset, and it has that similar kind of quality that I talk about with Tilt Brush, in that you can now get a sense of scale immediately. You can move things in 3D space without having to have that 2D screen and 2D abstraction in the way. You can look at lines for design and see what they're going to look like at scale. And it's kind of an interesting way to think of things in the future, is that maybe people will do things in a VR world rather than a fixed world or a 2D screen world. So I'm going to kind of finish it there after looking at all of that research and just wrap up with a few takeaways. So I think takeaways for me of looking at this is that, especially when you look at the research, is there's going to need to be a lot of content, like a lot. If we're looking at those stats that we saw earlier, there's going to need to be a lot of it. And I think you're going to want that to look as realistic as possible, because that's what consumers are expecting. That's what they expect when they see these feature films. That's what they expect when they're doing their personal lives on Facebook. They expect things digitally to be better than the things that in the real world, or hyperreal. And I think that's what we all need to think about, which means that it needs to be as realistic as possible. And I think another takeaway is it's going to do this efficiently. It's going to be about workflow and pipeline, making it scalable, because there's going to need to be so much content that, how are we going to do that without that kind of streamlining? And I think probably the final takeaway is that there's going to be a lot of content, and I don't know if there's enough people in the world to create all this 3D content if the claims of those numbers are true. So we need to get more people creating. We need to make the tools perhaps fundamentally better than they are now, so that people can create 3D objects faster. And I think that, or perhaps maybe not just create 3D content faster, but enable people who previously weren't able to create 3D content to be able to create 3D content. And I'll give you an example of that just to close off, which is an example from Oculus Story. They did a VR piece called Dear Angelica, which is an animation piece. It's all beautifully drawn animation, illustration sort of style. And it's a 3D world as well. You go inside it and everything looks 3D and animated. And that was actually drawn by an artist called Wesley Allsbrook, who's a 2D illustrator, 2D artist, and they built Quill specifically for that project, which is Oculus' version of Tilt Brush. And the amazing thing was that within a day or less, she was creating these 3D shapes that were just the most beautiful things, and really well rounded and shaped, and allowed her to create things that she only ever done on paper before. And I think what that says is that it was very quick to be able to do it, and VR is now an enabler for people that are doing 2D things to now step into 3D. Because if you set that same person, I bet, in front of Maya or any 2D illustrator in front of Maya, or even Modo, even though we think Modo is quicker to learn than Maya, I bet you they wouldn't be creating anything great within a day. Whereas I think with that power of, and some of that is to do with the technicalities of it as well, and I think with the power of VR, perhaps some of those technicality barriers can be lifted. So that's where I'm probably going to close it off and go to questions. How long have I gone on for? 45 minutes, probably enough of listening to me. So before I move on to questions, I'm just going to say a few words about Foundry Trends again, to remind you that these webinars are happening very often, and also that there's a lot of content up on Foundry Trends. So please sign up to it, because lots of exciting things happening there. So with that, I now will go to any questions if there are any. But I don't know how to work this bit. Questions. I click on questions. Pull it down. So the question is, what is the Google VR scan tool again? So it's called Project Tango, and it's actually part of the OS of the latest Google's Project Tango. So you can Google that, have a look. The actual scan tool that I was showing in the video was us using the technology in one of our research projects, where we're trying to merge the real world and the unreal world with proper lighting and detection of surfaces, so we can cast proper shadows and stuff like that on objects. Am I supposed to answer by talking or typing? Talking, good. Because if I had to type that could have been the end of the session. Oh, another question here. Sorry guys, I'm just working on the questions here. I'm going to make that smaller. Hold on, everybody. I'm still here. I'm just checking out the questions. Hold on. Okay, I'm back here. So I can see the questions a bit better now. So I'm just going to go on to the one saying from Mike, I believe. Can you explain the current limitations of animation rigs in VR once again? Yeah, so it's not that there's a limitation of rigs per se. It's just kind of a speed processing thing, because you need to execute the animation rigs in real time. And like I said earlier, in VR, that's quite fast. We're talking about 90 frames per second. Then if you make the rig too complicated, then it won't execute in real time, and then you're going to have issues with it slowing down. So which means that normally you need to make a low-res version of the rig and a high-res version for your movie assets. So ideally what you'd be able to do is make one rig and maybe have hints or something like that say when it's in a situation where it can't run the full rig, then it turns bits and pieces off. And then you have one rig that can be reused. That would be the ideal, but I've heard of people trying to do that, but it's not easy. So next question, how do you see Modo fitting into the Foundry suite of VR tools? So a few videos that I showed you earlier have some of what we're doing in R&D with Modo. So the thing earlier with the VR kind of inside of an interior, if you like, or exterior and interior, that was actually Modo connected directly to Oculus and Vive headsets. So I think that's really exciting, because it allows you to look at your 3D assets inside VR really quickly, and you can't currently do that very quickly at the moment because normally you have to go out to an intermediate, like you have to export to a game engine and then run the game engine to see VR. And with this research project, we can go directly from Modo to VR, and it's connected directly to VR. And the other thing I'd like to say about Modo connected to VR is that it's very well connected to the game engines already. So, you know, pushing one button and exporting out to Unreal or Unity is really simple. That other demo I showed you where we can push assets in a live connection to Unreal is really good as well. Next question was, are you aware of any research projects testing the ability of users to adjust the speed of their visuals? Speed of their visuals, that's interesting. So I'm not sure what that means by the speed of the visuals, but I'll take a punt at something similar in that I have seen types of story engines that allow you to adjust the speed of the story, if you like, or the way that the story progresses. So you can imagine if you're in a VR story and there's potentially action happening all around you, and perhaps some action starts to your right, there's the potential that the user won't look to the right and they'll miss that action. And you can get around that by having, you know, audio cues or flash of light or something like that that makes the user turn around. But sometimes even that will not make them turn around and they might miss it. So some of the tricks that I've seen are kind of game logic that will say, I'm going to wait till the user actually turns their head, like loop the action, and when they turn their head, trigger the new action to occur once they've looked in that direction. So that's, I don't know if that answered your question, but hopefully it was interesting anyway. Next question was, do you think immersive media is a proper catch-all term for the current technologies we're focusing on here? Yeah, I think that is a really good term. Immersive media is a really great term for it because it's that feeling of being completely immersed in the content really describes this, whether you're immersed by going into the VR environment where it's like all-encompassing, or whether you're immersed by having the content around you like mixed reality or augmented reality. So I think that's a really good term. Matt says one rig to rule them all. Yeah, that would be good. Is a way to quickly import LiDAR data into Modo or Nuke. I think the best way is to, well, importing in Modo as like a point cache is probably the best way, or exporting out as Limbic into both of them is probably the best way to get this stuff in. I think LiDAR data comes in many, many different formats, one of the tricks with it, but converting it to something like Limbic is probably your best bet. Those features are from Modo 11, question mark. One for Shane, one for Shane. Question from Joyce again. She says, I mean that some people process more slowly. I think I know what you mean then. So this is maybe the visuals perhaps in the Hyperreality video that I showed you where lots of things are flashing and so on. Could you adjust the speed? I imagine probably in a future when this stuff exists, you would be able to, because I know that when you go into your, you know, your iPhone, for instance, they have lots of settings for adjusting animation speed and turning off animations if your eyesight doesn't like them and things like that, accessibility settings. So I imagine when we get to a place where there's Magic Leap and whatever Microsoft's new version of AR will be, then they will think about those things. Oh, this is a controversial question. Maybe not controversial, but it says here, Unreal or Unity, which one would you recommend to a beginner? It's probably controversial, but because there's probably a bit of a holy war sometimes between these two game engines. I would say probably to start Unity, to be honest, and hopefully my friends at Epix aren't listening, but I think it is a good engine to start. It's like there's a lot of people using it, probably more than Unreal, so you get a lot of help online for it, and it works really well on mobiles and stuff like that. Unreal is really great as well. I'm not dissing Unreal. We've got good friends at Unreal and great visual quality and so on. It's used a lot in our clients when they're kind of doing cinematic style stuff. But I think as a start, probably Unity. I might get flamed for that, but it's personal opinion. Next question is, have you noticed any limitations in building environments in Unity Unreal? Not personally, but I'm probably not super expert on how much they can handle it. So I'm sorry, I can't probably answer that question in the best way, Dennis. I'm just reading Eric question. I feel like tools that can radically speed up the 3D asset creation and animation process will likely not fit nicely into current market demand. Has the Foundry started research into 3D asset creation and animation process? Example being the VR app rough animation. An example being this app called Mindshow. And then he says, but production-ready tools like this could be a very viable option in the future demand for lots more content. We've done some research into how we could make 3D content creation easier, definitely, but nothing that's kind of production-ready at this stage. I think it's a really exciting area that we're going to continue to explore, though, because, like I said earlier, that I think it needs to get easier because there's just going to be so much content out there. And ideally, you'd want to make it easier without making it more limited. Still more questions. I guess I'm looking at my producer. 2 more questions. Question from Niels. A lot of people, well, maybe more of a comment, a lot of people refer to film when discussing authorship in VR, AR, but perhaps architecture is a closer traditional art form. Yeah, it's a good point because because you're, well, with traditional film, you're in charge of the camera and you're in charge of the framing. There's nothing to restrict. Sorry, in VR, you're not in charge of the camera or not in charge of the frame, so the user can look wherever they want. And therefore, it is a bit more like architecture. You have to think about the whole space, not just what you're looking through in a kind of rectangular shape. So that's a good point. I'm going to do one more question. Oh, there's no more questions, so that's good timing. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I hope you thought it was interesting, and I'll just sign off there, but probably say one more word about Foundry Trends. Please sign up for Foundry Trends, and we're going to see you at a webinar really soon. In how many weeks' time? Unknown amount of weeks. Holding up 3 fingers in 3 weeks' time for the next webinar. But yeah, check out Foundry Trends. Sign up now. Thank you very much for listening.